What we got here is failure to communicate, a chronic neglect of military mental health care. This is Psychiatric Casualties, how and why the military ignores the full cost of war.
Well, hello and welcome to episode 3, and welcome again, Charles.
Well, welcome to you, Mark. This is Mark Russell, who just introduced himself. I'm Charles Figley, and we're here with this new show that we think you're going to like.
I think so too. So in the first 2 episodes, we talked about just kind of an introduction to military mental health care and what are some of the issues that we wrote about and that we wanted to talk about in this podcast. And so it leads us up to the first chapter of our book, Psychiatric Casualties, which is really kind of laying the historical foundations for understanding where we're at today as far as mental health in general, but also specifically in the military. And we provide a kind of a chronological history of issues around traumatic stress and trauma and pensions and all the debates and controversies around that from the time those began all the way up until modern times. So those are kind of the things that we'll be talking about in this episode and the next episode.
Yeah, we weren't exactly sure how to break things up because this is a real problem, and we have been at this for a long time together, and certainly separately we have been at this for a long time.
Yep.
I've dated mine as 50 years, but there's a lot of information that we have gathered and we published. Mark, I see Mark as the leader, not just as the first author of most of our publications, if not all of them, but he's the one who has been in the grass, in the dirt, in the details of mental health within the military. And you already heard in the last couple of sessions, it's challenging to be able to break this up and to be able to do justice to the knowledge that we've gathered, as well as how we have been blessed by the knowledge. Although I wouldn't say blessed by all of the knowledge. I don't know about you, Mark. Mark is now doing on a regular basis, reviewing military records, especially medical records. But Mark is helping the Navy and the VA to determine who should get PTSD or not, though the people that are attempting believe they have it and they need compensation for that, which they deserve. So both of us have been working in this area and want you to really enjoy and appreciate what we have learned. And as Mark says, we've selected 5 for this hour and the next hour to talk about. So Mark, do you want me to start or do you want to start?
Well, let me just start on something, and that is that I wanted to go back to maybe what I should have mentioned in our last episode, and which is like kind of the overall purpose of both our work together and researching and trying to publish and through documentary films the issues about military mental health care specifically, but about mental health care at large. And that is there are 3 real purposes to our work, and that includes what this podcast is about. And if I can, I'll just go ahead and read those off. All right. Sure. The first purpose is to generate public awareness about the nature and causes of preventable wartime crises and the military's attempts to resolve its mental health dilemma. And we'll talk more about that dilemma in just a few minutes. The second goal or purpose is to identify constructive solutions to improve the quality of mental health care, both inside and outside of the military. And then lastly, our third goal is to end the generational cycle of neglect and self-inflicted harm that is caused by specifically the military's willful negligence in remembering and trying to learn from their lessons learned through, the chronicles of war and what's been documented about.
It's really remarkable, Mark, as I look to prepare for today, the repeated error and just avoiding the obvious and trying to hide, even though it's right in front of us, all of us. It's really remarkable. And, I'm sure that the military has some degree of defensiveness, but it's not like they themselves, any one person has done this with regard to ignoring mental health or essentially using it as a way of beating someone over the head. It's probably very, very, very frustrating for. I have a good friend and colleague who got out of the military, just retired, I don't know, a couple of years ago, but he's very proud of his service. He was in Iraq. I mean, he had the full tour, the whole. He retired as a colonel. And Jeff talks glowingly about what our thesis is, what you just said, these three issues in particular, and wrote a glowing comment. He said, Jeffrey Yarvis wrote, Russell and Figley provide a blood-stirring and much-needed examination of the many reasons that behavioral health concerns continue to affect the ranks of the military. This book should be a mandatory reading for everyone concerned with the care and well-being of America's forces from indoctrination to discharge and beyond. I mean, it seems like that's as good a review as you would want. And I'm not saying to promote our book necessarily, but I am, though, promoting what we are studying and what we are learning and what we want to share with all of our fellow veterans or anyone else who's interested. And let me just say, with regard to these three issues, they're very, very important, and we are going to cover them a little bit later. Mm-hmm. If I have a role in this hour-long session each week, thank you. I'm going to be talking about military families and children, but also the wives and husbands of those who are in the military or have been in the military, and particularly after they came home, and how best to handle their issues and challenges. I want to start a dialogue with that, and hoping that eventually wives and children will send us notes or emails or call in. We haven't set that up yet. But they're the ones who are the legacy of the errors that the military has made with regard to mental health. They're the ones that have to pay the price for the absence of this veteran's mind, in effect. They're not all there frequently from time to time. And certainly it was the case for my father from time to time. I can talk about that sometime along the way. But I'm looking forward to hearing from everybody and learning what you all are interested in. Mark?
Yeah, so at the end of the show, and end of every show, I'll provide the listeners my email address so that they, we can start to get some of that feedback from people, either their own lived experiences or questions or things they want us to talk about, things that they might not agree with. So we'll hopefully start to get some feedback from people. Until that time, we're kind of speaking, and hopefully we have people listening, and then we'll again try to reach out and have a little more dialogue.
Well, let me just jump in, Mark, if you don't mind, and so the first thing we really want to talk about is the military and medical dilemmas that were discussed in Chapter 1. We certainly talk about it more throughout the book. Yeah. But that in particular is what we're focusing on here. But it's on page 23, 24 in particular, focus on it. But it's really the marriage, as we have talked about. Let me this a little bit larger here. Yeah, it's the marriage between medicine and the military, and that's no easy thing. And we talk about what it has been like throughout the ages with regard to needing to link those two. The military apparently has always had some form of medical assistance, et cetera, but we hope to discuss, and we hope to discuss with you someday. We can discuss the challenges and suspicion of the military medical, and it's essentially the uncomfortable working together, those that are focused on an objective and all the things that are involved in that, and then those that are responsible for taking care of patching up, our own people. There is in this underlying military morale issue, and when military and healers are combined, it's a challenge because one may be operating in a very different space. It certainly does more often than not, and may not, be able to do that. I want to talk about table one, but Mark, do you want to talk more about that?
Well, yeah, just a couple of thoughts. And this is the idea of the mental health dilemma that the military faces. And it's not just the military, our government, as well as just society chases. And that, you can trace back since the Roman legions that, they had medicine healers brought with the legionnaires. And the reason of that is to heal and bind the wounds so that people can go back to fight. And that was the idea. Is the first mission of the military, of course, is to fight and win wars. That's the whole purpose of the military. That's in their mission statement, right? That's why militaries have existed since, human beings started to organize into societies. And so military medicine's emergence into that difficult relationship you talked about had to do with preserving the force to fight. And so you have the primary mission of the military is to fight and win wars, and the primary mission of military medicine is to preserve the fighting force so they can fight and win those wars. The second mission that has evolved with military medicine and the military at large is one of force protection, and that is preventing illness, restoring people to fitness for duty, and basically protecting people's health as a means to support the warfighting mission. So those are two distinct but overlapping missions that create the dilemma. And that what military medicine faced was the people in the fighting military would sometimes look at medicine as skeptically as giving people a way out of combat by sending them to the back lines to recover or to allow them to get out of the army altogether. And so there's always been this skepticism about medicine, but that has magnified 1,000-fold when it comes to mental health in the military. And that the mental health didn't really have a footing until the First World War. And bringing in the military mental health, and we'll talk more about this later, was to preserve the fighting force. But the skepticism ran rampant, and the distrust about mental health professionals in the military has never wavered, to be quite honest. In my years as a military psychologist, it was routine. We were valued as a force multiplier, but if we started to diagnose or to remove people from the front lines, we would be viewed as literally the enemy, or being conspiratory towards the enemy.
Mark, tell our friends listening your experience with training and the use of people, and you know what I'm talking about.
Well, okay, so I don't know if I shared this in our first few episodes, but so we're training to ramp up for a field hospital that was going to deploy in support of the Iraq invasion in 2003. And we went to Camp Pendleton and had a kind of a field hospital set up, and they had all the mock Hollywood scenes of casualties being helicoptered in or transported in, and all the battle sounds and sights, explosions, etc., and very realistic battlefield injuries, right? And so I'm in this exercise, and I'm the head of neuropsychiatry for our field hospital, and I'm sitting there with my team, and we're about 2 or 3 hours into the exercise, and all the medical casualties and people were busy triaging, and people busy working and trying to simulate healing those folks. We never got anything. And I asked about, well, about mental health, what about behavioral health? And I said, oh, Russell, sit tight, they're coming. And so we did get, about an hour later, we did get our first psychiatric casualty in order to prepare for this invasion in Iraq. And it was a young Marine Lance Corporal female who was dressed in a cape, a black cape and a hood, and had Batgirl kind of taped to her utilities. So our first realistic scenario of treating the war stress injuries was Batgirl, and that was just the very beginning of a whole series of events that basically led to my becoming a military whistleblower and trying to get the country to focus on seriously about the issues of mental health and the epidemic that we were seeing.
Mhm. The rest is history for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's shocking and amazing. We had, when I was in the Marine Corps in Vietnam, we had a number, I can't recall how many, but at least 4 or 5 simulations in which we were expected to, do what we're supposed to do. And no one really took it. Well, some of the officers took it seriously, but none of us did really. And it seemed like it showed with regard to the non-commissioned officers, definitely. They weren't in it that much. But it's interesting, though, that right up into when you were preparing for war, that this kind of lack of seriousness still wasn't there. When where so many people died following in the actual war. It's pretty pathetic. But I wanted to also move on and talk about table 1.1.
Oh, yeah. All right.
1.1 suggests the price of war and the absolute necessity of military health and mental health. Absolutely, without a doubt. The range of mortality rates, if you look at the grand scheme of things, the scale of things,
right,
were associated with the particular wars. And let me just mention here, it is the battle mortality from antiquity to the 21st century.
Yep.
And they first talked about the particular era, then the war, then the total medically wounded, and then mortality. And it's, when you look at this table, it starts with 1194 to 1184 BCE, the Trojan War, and then following the Punic War, mortality in the Trojan War was 90%. 90%.
Yeah, if you were wounded, essentially you would die.
Yeah.
Again, this is before antibiotics, before anything about sanitary, hospitalized treatment, medical treatment. So yeah,
There was not much they could do.
It was baked in by that time, yeah.
But it's interesting that the American Revolution, 1777, 1775 and beyond, had 42% mortality, which is very, very high.
Yeah.
It went down subsequently over the years, but World War II had 30%.
Yeah.
But interestingly, World War I had 21%.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to wrap around why that wouldn't be reversed in some way.
Yeah, you'd think, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
But it's interesting. Could you talk a little bit, Mark, about the later years, the 2001 to 2012? Because that mortality rate is 10%.
Yeah, you look at from the Vietnam, Korean War, and the first Gulf War, it's basically about 24-25% mortality rate, meaning that if you got wounded, physically wounded, that you would have, that's the percent that would die from their wounds, often due to infections or disease and things of that sort. But then you get into the 21st century wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and you're looking at a 10% mortality rate, meaning that you have a 90% survivability, which is completely 180 degrees from the Trojan War that you said. We used to die, 90% of us would die from a wound in antiquity, but now only 10% of us would die from those same wounds because, and I think this is the lesson that is trying to draw on here, is that it's because we learn our medical lessons of war. We've applied combat medicine, not just in the military, but outside the military. And learning the lessons, the hard fought lessons, is the crucial anecdote to what's ails us today as far as mental health care. And that we have a repeated failure to learn psychiatric lessons, but on the medical lesson front, we're doing military medicine leads the way often, and is often cutting edge in terms of new medical technology and life-saving tactics and prevention of disease and illness, etc.
Yeah, and going on to the next one, do you want to say any more about
I
what
don't.
we're talking about
Yeah, as far
tonight?
as lessons learned, we're going to talk more about that later on in other episodes. But I just want to kind of, if I can, just provide a brief overview about the first part of understanding where we at with traumatic stress injuries or PTSD. That is to understand that there's been an ongoing debate around trauma and pensions for trauma, and then as well as PTSD. So these are referred to as trauma pension wars by a lot of authors, and we do go through that chronology. I just want to highlight a couple of snippets, if I can, to give an idea of what we're dealing with today and what the roots of that are. So if you go back into, we talked last week about nostalgia, which is the first war stress syndrome that was identified in Europe, and kind of looking forward from that, there were other wars where people were starting to develop these unexplained physical health symptoms and psychiatric symptoms combined. That would be depression, anxiety, or some type of conversion reactions, PTS, all these things rolled up. All these symptoms were available in records from, the 17th century and earlier in some cases. But it really hit the head in the industrial age. In the industrial age in Europe and North America, you had the advent of machines, you had the advent of locomotives and other forms of motorized transportation, and as well as more mechanized industrial bases for warfare. So you had the advent of machine guns and high blast artillery, repeating small arms fires and grenades and mines and all these other technologies that grew out of the industrial age. But the first part of trauma pension controversy really has to do with industrial accidents or transportation accidents, railroad accidents. And in 1864, a British physician named John Erickson coined the term of these kind of post-traumatic accidents from railroads. He called it railway spine. It was called railway brain in the United States. And basically, these would be people who were involved in train accidents and were jostled around very violently and then had these lingering symptoms that today would be a mix of TBI, traumatic brain injury, and PTSD, and a range of other psychiatric symptoms or diagnosis. So in 1864, after this railway spine and railway brain became part of the medical legal vernacular, in 1864, the British legislation adopted a tort act that allowed individuals to sue the industrial base, including railway companies, but also in factories, to sue for these traumatic stress injuries. And in Germany, the term they used was traumatic neurosis, which is a direct precursor to what we call PTSD today. And in Germany in 80 something, they had German revised their legislation toward acts, and so that you could sue in Germany the same people that you could sue now in British and North America. And what this set up was a real debate about, one, is trauma a legitimate injury? Is a legitimate form of suffering? And is it compensable then? Are you allowed to get some type of compensation for that injury? And is it the same as if you were to crack your skull or lose an arm in those accidents? Should it be regarded in the same breath? And so back in 1864, in the later 1800s, the law of the land in Europe and North America was that traumatic neuroses, or what later be called accident neuroses, were compensable, that they were legitimate types of suffering, no different than any physical injury. And that became the medical legal paradigm about traumatic stress. And that leads up to the First World War. And, the First World War started in 1914 and ran through 1918. And there you had unprecedented numbers of psychiatric casualties. That you'd seen some aspects of that in earlier wars because of the industrialization of warfare, but never to the levels we saw in the First World War. And this is, people refer to shell shock and as kind of one of the first examples of a PTSD precursor. And that's not true. There were a lot of other examples of conditions before shell shock, but shell shock itself was viewed as changes in the brain that happen as a result of trauma. So basically, it took traumatic neurosis, which also talked about functional changes to the brain due to exposure to trauma, and it made it militarized and referred to as shell shock instead. And a lot of people were being sent from the back lines with shell shock, leaving the front lines, and the fighting force was being attrited, being reduced. And we're talking tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people being evacuated for shell shock. That initially was treated like as a legitimate physical wound of war. And people in the British Army were actually given the Red Stripe for shell shock, which is the equivalent of a Purple Heart in the American military. And then it reached a crisis in 1916. And the German, in every armed force, was dealing with these epidemics of psychiatric casualties and not understanding why they're existing and what we can do to remove this threat, because it was a threat for them to prosecute the war. It was that level of attrition. And in September of 1916, it's another day of infamy that, again, almost no one would be aware of, unless you're a nerdy historian like myself. There was a Congress in Munich, Germany, and this is, again, during the war, where they brought together all the experts in trauma at that time, psychological trauma and medicine. And they voted to basically uproot the accepted paradigm, which was that traumatic stress injuries are real and they are genuine and deserve to be compensated for. And they upended that and said that they outlawed the use of traumatic neurosis and shell shock. In some cases, like in the German army, it was for the threat of death for any physician who would diagnose anybody with a traumatic neurosis or shell shock injury. And instead adopted the new paradigm, which exists primarily today, and that is of traumatic hysteria, which is this notion that Sigmund Freud and Jean Charcot and others had promulgated, which is that people who develop traumatic stress injuries were really predisposed due to some weakness in their moral character, to personality defects, to greed because they wanted a pension or a disability and were trying to gain compensation for it. So that became the new paradigm halfway through the First World War. And that became the American military's policy too. Basically saying we're not going to diagnose traumatic neurosis or shell shock or give any legitimacy to psychiatric conditions because of the fear of those evacuation syndromes or the attrition, mass attrition of psychiatric casualties. It's like you were going to say something.
But it seems like also they saved a lot of money.
Yeah, I left that part out. So thank you. So after going back to that 1864, when Europe and North America had changed their medical legal paradigm to accept traumatic stress injury as a legitimate form of suffering, the industrial base fought back, and the business owners fought back, and they hired a whole slew of neurological, medical experts to argue the opposite, that these traumatic neuroses were not real and genuine, and they were of a more of a hysterical variety. But the traumatic neurosis had won the day. There was more evidence, and there was more, the legal system thought that was a more appropriate conclusion up until September 1916, as I said, when the World War it really kind of brought home the whole idea that we have to do something about the epidemic of psychiatric casualties that were being sent back home to France, to Britain, to Germany, etc. And they were getting compensation, they were getting pensions. And the military was afraid at the same time they're not going to be able to fight this war any longer due to the rate of evacuation of these individuals, and that it would bankrupt society by giving all these people a pension on top of it. Not only are you going to erode the will to fight, but you're reinforcing it in what they call pension neurosis, which is you're feeding this frenzy of people seeking pensions and escape from combat by accepting this paradigm. So that's why they opted to change the paradigm in a military conference that said now it's all viewed as hysteria, as a pseudo illness, and it's not compensable, and it's not to be rewarded. In fact, treatment is very harsh, and if people who feigned supposedly psychiatric illness, and that became where the medical legal paradigm was changed in society to what the military had adopted in order to fight its war.
Well, let me go back, Mark, if you don't mind, to you talked about a phenomenon that very few people have referenced, at least, but it definitely existed and was a justification for the military in developing not that great at, well, let me just tell you, evacuation syndrome. Could you tell us what that means?
Yeah, so the evacuation syndrome, again, this is what they saw. It wasn't only the First World War, they saw some concerns about that in earlier wars as well. But it was the mass attrition of frontline armed forces that had developed psychiatric symptoms that were being diagnosed as, again, shell shock or traumatic neurosis at the time. And it led to the fear. It wasn't actually a realistic fear, but it was a fear of the military that this could expand to a mass hysteria, a mass evacuation where everybody dropped their weapons and would go run to the back lines, feigning, shell shock or whatever traumatic neurosis, and that the war would be over, that the Allies, or in the case of the Axis powers, would lose the war. So that fear of the leadership, it was a fear of the government of having to pay all these people pensions, combined to what they refer to as evacuation syndromes, which is that once you open the back door, a floodgate will prevail, and then the military will lose its capacity to achieve its primary mission.
Mark, do you have recall any particular examples or instances of evacuation syndrome? Because going into the back, is there an event in which a plane landed and they loaded up all the patients, and what was the example? I know what you're talking about, in that it's a fear of those that are planning the wars and executing them, etc., afraid of that.
Right.
And I'm not sure how I feel about that, but just the general examples of when this would happen.
Well, yeah, I think again, you could trace it to 1916. Before they changed the medical legal paradigm and adopted traumatic hysteria as the primary basis for psychiatric casualties. The Battle of Somme was raging in Europe, and that battle was one of the most intense ever fought. And again, high industrialized warfare at its absolute worst. And I think in the first minute, the first hour, the British Army suffered something like 62,000 casualties just in the opening salvos of the Battle of Somme. And overall, I think the British Army had 500,000 casualties in that one battle. And that doesn't speak to the French and to the British. This is before the Americans entered in 1918. And at the time that they were having that many casualties, you had a huge amount, and there's not a firm number on it, but it's tens of thousands of enlisted and officers from all different armed forces were being diagnosed with shell shock or traumatic neurosis and sent off the front lines, to hospitals. And so that combination of the psychiatric casualties on top of the physical casualties, that kind of fed into this hysteria of the military's leadership that psychiatric casualties are going to be that mass evacuation that will end the war for us, our ability to execute the war. And they did everything in their power to stomp that out. And that led to that conference in Germany in September of 1916. But then all the Allied and the Axis powers all agreed to it. That was one thing they agreed while they're fighting this war, is they're going to prevent psychiatric casualties by outlawing the use of those diagnoses and doing battlefield executions for cowardice and incarcerating people and making examples of people, really weaponizing stigma to a whole new degree, and bringing in psychiatrists for the first time in the military in order to stem the tide of these epidemics of evacuations coming on for psychiatric casualties.
Mark, have you talked to psychiatrists about this?
Oh, sure.
What do they say?
Well, some of them nod and agree that that's my understanding, it's my experience and what I've lived. And others would say they totally disagree. They believe that this whole problem with PTSD, for example, is manufactured, and it's a societal issue of society's weakness, and psychiatry has played a role in corroding that toughness in men to be able to withstand the stresses of war. And these are even psychiatrists that are openly hostile towards the construct of PTSD and labeling people with PTS or PTSD in the military so that they would be removed from the front lines.
And that's still happening today?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. The whole advent of what we call frontline or forward psychiatry, where you bring mental health professionals to the military and at the front line, grew out of that World War I experience and fear of evacuation syndromes. And they basically weaponized psychiatry to say, we're going to have you help people who are having some type of nervous breakdown on the front lines. They're going to withdraw them from the little brief respites of kind of 3 days, 3 days of meals, 3 days of sleep, and then with the expectation that they are absolutely going back to those front lines and there is no escape for them. And that frontline policy exists today. It's been 100 years since that has been enacted. And nowadays, in the American policy for frontline psychiatry, it's explicit. It says that they expect that 90%, I think 90 or 95% will be returned to duty. And the only way that people will be evacuated from the front lines is if they are grossly impaired, meaning that they have some psychotic break, and or that they are a clear danger to themselves, meaning that they've actually attempted suicide. Just thinking of it would often not be enough to warrant a evacuation from the front lines. But you'd have to actually have made attempts either to kill yourself or kill your fellow soldiers, Marines, or whatnot.
So it's not that you were diagnosed with PTSD. That wouldn't do it with regard to sending people, but the RTDs?
Well, there's a real robust effort in today's military, and this has started in the First World War again, to avoid labeling people with a diagnosis, especially like PTSD. They might be, given a diagnosis like an adjustment reaction, or usually it's going to be an acute stress reaction or something like that. That would be considered to be non-pathological and wouldn't affect their fitness for duty. So all efforts are made to avoid things like PTSD, especially anything near the front lines. And that's today's doctrine for combat operational stress, as they call it now.
Even though it happens all the time. I mean, those men and women who are suffering from PTSD, irrespective of those elements that stand out and definitely qualify them.
Yeah.
But
Charles, the important point too to highlight is that policy that was adopted in the First World War is that essentially boils down to this: that you are not to leave the front lines if you're experiencing a nervous breakdown or a psychiatric break, unless you are so impaired that you're psychotic or that you actually have tried to kill yourself or kill a fellow soldier or something. So, and the idea is that you will go back to the front line. So every time you need a respite, you come and get a 3-day respite or a short respite. But your expectation is, again, 95% are going to go back to the front lines and keep going back to the front lines. So they keep getting more dosage of combat stress or war stress. They still have, they're developing more and more symptoms, and they keep going back to these respite centers and then back to the front lines until the point you break. And when you fully break, then the idea of restoration, it becomes much more difficult, and it becomes more permanent. Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah, we're going to talk a lot more about that whole policy, get more in the weeds of that. But again, that's just a short kind of trying to provide a brief overview of it.
But it, just as you say, it's a constant challenge. It's in the mix all the time.
Yeah.
The combat experiences, the combat stressors, whether it's diagnosis or not, men are very good at hiding their symptoms, and that is just encouraging them to do that.
Well, it is, and
the VA takes care of them, apparently.
Yeah, and again, you can see, again, for the primary mission of the military is to fight and win wars, and so soldiers from the very beginning of human warfare had fear and had anxiety and had a lot of emotional issues. But the argument is that they sucked it up. They had the stiff upper lip, and they did their manly duties and fought the wars. And you need that if you're going to have a military to have a fighting force. So that's the real dilemma, is that on one hand, you need the military to fulfill its primary mission, but then you also need that force health protection too. At what point do we are looking out for the individual and their health and their family's health? And when do our policies become harmful to that individual and their families in order for that primary mission to be that overrides that force protection mission?
Yeah, speaking of families, much of my work really has been involved with families, at least early on. And the people that suffer are those that are not ashamed of admitting that they have symptoms. Those are the spouses, the wives, the kids, and the struggles that they've had. Has the military in any way realized that this policy has a negative impact on families?
Absolutely not. The US military has never researched the efficacy and the potential harm or the potential benefits of their forward psychiatry, frontline psychiatry, combat operational stress. I think there's been a couple studies done, but most of it's been done by the Israeli army.
Yeah.
And in our reviewing that, that Israelis found from their studies of combat stress and implementing the forward psychiatry is that there's a lot more conflict at home when people get home, and that family members are suffering along with the service members as they have been exposed to excessive amounts of combat stress. So they kept being returned back to the front lines until they break, or that they are no longer able to fight, and then they go back home, and then there's these problems just manifest and multiply when they get home, and their spouses and their children all affected as a consequence as well.
I'm wondering, has there been any efforts to serve as a listening post or some way of accessing the experiences of spouses? Is it that those that are serving are concerned about promotion and rank, et cetera, and not want to bring any attention whatsoever, so they would discourage their spouse from speaking up?
Yeah, I think
I
there's
know
some
there's
of that.
several questions.
There was a study done by the U.S. Army out of Walter Reed, Charles Hodge and his group in
Oh, yeah.
2004, right? And this was published in New England Journal of Medicine. It was really the first real-time study done about the psychiatric effects of war in the 21st century. And they looked at PTSD, depression, and anxiety rates that are going exponentially higher as the longer you're exposed to war stress, and when they got back. But then they looked at stigma, and they looked at stigma not only from the individual warfighter's perspective, which was like 70-80%, whatever, people would not disclose for fear of being perceived as weak or being forced out of the military, but they looked at family members' views of mental health. And I want to say it's either 2004 or 2006 when they did a follow-on study with family, but the family members had just about the same level of fear of stigma and the effects that's going to have on their spouse's career, the income for the family, to the extent that they did not want their family member to go get mental health help because they're going to lose, their job, and that's going to have a real negative effect on the family. So that was I think a first really good look at a real-time stresses and the factors that family have to deal with too when it comes to trying to help their loved one deal with war stress.
So there's really no movement that you're aware of to connect the family, to make sure that they're protected, to reduce the hesitance of speaking up and talking about what it's like being in a family with a vet, with an active duty, either way.
Yeah, I'm certainly not aware of any kind of nationwide or a DoD-wide program to that effect. I think
no experimental studies.
There may be some things out there that are being done. I think a lot of it's probably done through nonprofits and reaching out for veterans and family members of veterans. But again, family members, as we both know, have always kind of had the short end of the stick when it comes to mental health care for themselves, but also, their, support programs for these spouses and children who are supporting the war fighters. And we always give lip service to the value of military spouses and military families, but we don't typically back it up with any real resources that have been proven to be, even modestly meeting the needs of military families.
Well, it seems like it will happen anytime in the near future, given circumstances.
No, it won't. And the same reason why the military struggles with its mental health dilemma is that the fear is that if you treat mental health on par as physical health, and psychological wounds are not any different as far as legitimacy than physical wounds, which was the pre-1960, 1916 medical legal doctrine and the paradigm at the time. The fear is, though, if you treat it on par with physical wounds, it's going to open the floodgates, and it will cause mass attrition, those evacuation syndromes, and it will lead to bankruptcy because you're going to be paying more and more disability compensation. And there's some truth to that. These last wars, I think it was like 700% increase in VA disability claims for PTSD or something along those lines. It's skyrocketed. And people will point to a lot of different reasons. Again, it's because of the negative influence of psychiatry. It's due to our society being weaker, everything except the war itself, and the technological advances that have helped militaries fight and win wars has also led to more and more psychiatric casualties, far exceeding any of the physical wounds of war now since the Second World War.
Okay, well, we're close to the end of this hour. I want to thank everyone for listening. What we're going to talk about the next time from the program, let's see, we're going to talk about World War II and relearning the realities of modern war.
Yeah.
And that's going to be interesting, including in March 1943, U.S. Army Captain Frederick Hansen utilized the, quote, brief period of sedation and rest, along with techniques of suggestion and ventilation. It's demonstrated 30% of acute psychiatric casualties could be returned to duty. So
Right.
Among the things that we're going to talk about was the return to duty and the challenges that Hansen, of course, faced in terms of the study, but there's a lot of challenges there. So we're going to talk about next time.
Yes.
We'll also talk about the Vietnam War, one that I fought in. Okay. Among the 8.5 million who served in Vietnam. So we'll talk about that. And Mark, I'm hoping you're going to remark about no military research has been conducted that compared the outcomes of frontline psychiatry RTD with psychiatric evacuation and treatment.
Right. Yeah, we could talk more about that as well.
Yeah.
So
let me talk about one other thing that we're going to be doing, and then hope you'll talk about the sixth point. We're going to be focusing on post-war mental health analyses. So the Congress mandated the National Vietnam Veterans Readjustment Study. So we're going to be talking about that and what are the implications of it at the time, but mostly just talking about the experiences of Vietnam combat veterans.
Right. So we got a lot to cover.
Right.
A lot to try to jam in. And just going to leave my email address if any listeners want to contact us and provide us some feedback or any questions that you have that we can entertain. We would be very much appreciative of that. And that email address is mrussell, RUSSELL PhD @gmail.com. And we'll look forward to picking this up again on the next episode.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.